Good morning, everybody, and happy Mother's Day. I should really start by congratulating Stephen on somehow managing to intertwine the two themes of cleaning and anxiety into the basis of a talk for Mothering Sunday. Very nicely done. I am a mum of two. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son, and I would say that at the moment, a disproportionate amount of my time and energy are taken up by cleaning and anxiety. Sometimes I even manage to do both at the same time. Motherhood, or parenthood, is an enormous privilege, but it also comes with a huge potential for anxiety. For me, even the journey to becoming a mother was fraught with anxiety, something that I've spoken about up here before. Once the baby finally arrives, they open up a whole new world of anxiety that you never even knew existed. As the child grows, the scope for anxiety seems to grow with them. Worries about feeding and sleeping become concerns about meeting milestones, which then give way to fears about friendships and exams. Although not everybody here is a parent, we all have parents, and that comes with anxiety as well. Parents grow older at the same rate that children do, and fears around old age can grow too. Ill health, loss of independence, bereavement. Add to this the fact that some relationships between parents and their children aren't always straightforward. That can cause a great deal of stress and anxiety as well. Some of us feel anxiety more acutely than others, although recent events like the COVID pandemic, several new global conflicts arising, and a cost of living crisis mean that every one of us is likely to have been affected by anxiety in the last few years. I think it's fair to say that anxiety is something that is unavoidable, a normal, universal part of the human experience. This would have been no different for Jesus and his disciples. The passage we heard read to us this morning about Jesus walking on the water is a perfect example of this. It's one of the most well-known stories in the New Testament. Lots of studies and talks have been done on it, partly because it resonates with us on a personal level. I think something about this event speaks to our own experience of what it is to be an anxious human in a chaotic world. We draw a parallel between the literal storm that the disciples found themselves in and the metaphorical storms of our lives. We learn from Peter's experience. We're challenged, inspired by his willingness to get out of the boat. And perhaps we also recognize our own tendency to take our eyes off Jesus and focus on the waves and the storm and become filled with doubts. We usually hear about the events of Jesus' life in isolation, a miracle he performed, an interaction he had with someone, a story he told. I don't feel that I always have a very good grasp of the timeline of events, what happened when, and how they all fit together. And the passage we heard this morning, Matthew 14, tells the story of one whole day in the life of Jesus and his disciples, from start to finish. One day that contains 3 very distinct events, all of which cause quite a lot of anxiety, but each in different ways. So, what does Matthew 14, this day in the life of Jesus, have to teach us about anxiety? And how can our faith make a difference during tough times? Well, to begin with, this passage acknowledges that the world can feel chaotic and unpredictable. The chapter opens with a shocking account of the sudden death of John the Baptist. He'd been executed during one of King Herod's birthday parties, and his head had been delivered to the king on a platter. His death appears to have been the consequence of a frivolous oath made in the midst of a drunken celebration, which I think makes it all the more horrific. A completely unnecessary tragedy. John's followers retrieve and bury his body, and then they go back and break the news to Jesus and his disciples. Sometimes bad things happen that are completely out of our control and completely unexpected. The disciples didn't see this coming. Nobody, not even Herod, saw this coming. It wasn't a great move politically for Herod to have done this. It didn't make sense. For Jesus' disciples, this will have come as a huge shock. John was Jesus' cousin. Some of the disciples had been followers of John before they had met Jesus. He'd have been a close personal friend of theirs. The news of John's death would have hit them hard. Most of us probably don't like to think about this, but on a level, we all know, don't we, that disaster can strike at any moment. It's not something that we might choose to dwell on, but we're confronted daily by news stories that make it feel as though the world is chaotic and out of control. Most of us will have been through times of stress or uncertainty in our personal lives and have found ourselves spiraling, fixating on what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. We may try to rationalize or to hope for the best, but each of us here knows that sometimes the worst does happen, and there is absolutely nothing we can do to prevent it. Those of us who are perhaps slightly more prone to anxiety will know what it's like to live for days, weeks, or even months with a nebulous sense of apprehension that never goes away, a constant fear of an unknown disaster that might be waiting for us just around the corner. So, what can we do about it? Is there anything that can help? In the Sermon on the Mount, the collection of teachings that this series of talks has been based on, Jesus specifically talks about anxiety. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? When I was reading through this passage in preparation for this talk, it struck me that in this instance, Jesus is speaking about anxiety we may feel about potential future suffering, not pain that we are experiencing in the here and now. Don't worry about what you will eat or what you will wear. Jesus isn't denying that life can be really hard. He's not failing to acknowledge that we do experience real pain and hardship. Instead, he's prompting us to be present, to try to live in the moment. This isn't going to be an idea that's new to us. We'll all have heard this countless times before, but I think it's something that we all need reminding of. It can be very easy to spend quite a lot of time worrying about things that might not ever actually happen, things that we can't do anything about. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Jesus ends his teaching on anxiety by encouraging us instead to focus on the things that we can do and the things that we can change, living in a way that honors God and embodying his kingdom values in the world around us. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. So, back to the day in the life of Jesus and his disciples. They've just received the devastating news about John the Baptist. What happens next? Verse 13 tells us that they withdraw by boat privately to a solitary place. I think this demonstrates a really healthy attitude towards self-care. They've been hit with disaster, they're in shock, they allow themselves to withdraw, to forget whatever else they were meant to be doing that day, to give themselves time and space to grieve and to process what has happened. But the people around them have other plans. Word gets around about where they're headed, and crowds of people turn up to meet them there. So much for finding time and space for themselves. But the Bible says that they respond with compassion. Jesus heals people and teaches them. And then, as evening approaches, the disciples finally encourage Jesus to send the crowds away. They've given them plenty of time now. They've already gone above and beyond, and people are going to need to eat soon anyway. Instead of sending the crowds away, though, Jesus says to his disciples, "You give them something to eat." What? This isn't their area of expertise. They haven't planned for this. They've had no warning, no time to prepare. They've got no resources at their disposal. They're out in the middle of nowhere, and the only food in the entire crowd is 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish. And besides, they're grieving. They're not really in the right headspace to be looking after everyone else. They need to be taking care of themselves. The demand that's been made of them is not only unreasonable, it's literally impossible. I wonder how many of us have found ourselves feeling the same way. Perhaps we've been anxious about our ability to live up to other people's expectations of us, afraid of failing or letting people down, worried about not being enough. Perhaps, either at work or at home, we've experienced feeling weighed down by the pressure of unrealistic demands on our time or abilities or resources. We might even sometimes feel like we're being asked, by God or by the people around us, to do the impossible. Of course, we know how this story goes. We know that through Jesus, 5 loaves and 2 fish actually turns out to be more than enough to feed thousands of people. But what an emotional roller coaster for the disciples. A day that began with grief and despair following the news about John the Baptist, to suddenly find themselves at the center of a miracle, feelings of elation, bewilderment, and then where to even start trying to process what they've just witnessed and what that means about Jesus and who he is. Have you ever been caught in an impossible position, trapped in a situation with no way out, or faced with an obstacle that seemed impossible to overcome? This story reminds us that nothing is impossible with God. We might not see spectacular miracles like the feeding of the 5,000 in our own lives, but we may have experienced more everyday miracles than we realize. An unexpected windfall just in time to pay off a bill that had been keeping us up at night. The kindness of a stranger lending a hand at the exact moment that we were about to reach breaking point. A health scare that turned out to be nothing. There is no such thing as coincidence with God. I know from experience that it's much easier to identify times when things didn't go as we had hoped, and our prayers appear to have gone unanswered. We don't always stop and notice the times when things went better than anticipated, or our fears appear to have been unfounded. Let's try to remember to stop and take a moment to enjoy the flood of relief, or the moment that the weight has been lifted off our shoulders, and to give thanks that nothing is impossible with God. But back to Jesus and the disciples. It has been a long and exhausting day. Jesus tells his disciples to go home, that he'll stay and dismiss the crowd and then catch up with them later. I'm sure they were only too happy to oblige. They get back into the boat and set off across the lake. Little do they know, the day isn't over yet. Galilee is a big lake, roughly 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. Apparently, in good weather, they'd have expected to be able to cross it in less than 2 hours. It certainly didn't seem to have been a difficult journey when they arrived there that morning. But Lake Galilee is in a valley surrounded by very tall mountains. So the combination of warm air rising up from the lake and cool air dropping down as it comes over the mountains means that fierce, swirling winds can whip up quite suddenly, causing enormous waves to develop without warning, even to this day. The disciples get caught up in a huge storm, and a journey that should have been a straightforward row across the lake towards home turns into them battling huge waves and strong winds all through the night. Verse 24 says, "Later that night, the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it." It doesn't sound as though they were in any immediate danger. Several of them had been fishermen before they had met Jesus, so they would have experienced many storms like this and would have had the knowledge and the skills needed to get through it. But it was definitely a very difficult crossing at the end of a very difficult day. This storm was the very last thing they needed. I expect every single one of us has been through times when it felt like the winds of life were against us. We know what it is to be overwhelmed with anxiety when a situation has suddenly gone from bad to worse. Some of us may even have gone through periods of living in fear that the storm we are going through might actually break us. To the ancient Hebrews, the sea was traditionally a place of chaos and anarchy and evil spirits, like Leviathan. There was a first century superstition that the souls of those who had drowned haunted the waters at night. The disciples had been out in the storm for hours, physically and emotionally exhausted, pushed to their limits. Just when they think things can't possibly get any worse, a ghost appears in the darkness, walking towards their boat, and they are terrified. They may not ordinarily have believed in ghosts, but they'd just heard about the brutal and horrifying death of John the Baptist, and then watched as 5 loaves and 2 fish turned into enough food for thousands of people. I would imagine that at this point, tired and delirious as they were, anything might have seemed possible. At times of extreme stress, when we're overwhelmed, it's very easy to lose perspective. But what happened next is the climax of the whole story. Jesus immediately says to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." But they're still in the middle of the storm. They're still in the boat. The waves are continuing to come crashing down on them, and in a way, nothing about their situation has changed. Why hasn't Jesus stopped the storm? Why did he let them get into the boat in the first place? Why didn't he come with them? They've been out here, frightened and on their own, for hours. Why did he wait until just before dawn to come out to meet them in the storm? And if we're honest, I wonder whether there are times when we feel distant from Jesus, and perhaps a bit resentful of that. Perhaps we even feel angry that we had been close to him and doing his work and doing everything that he'd asked, and then all of a sudden we're abandoned in a boat in the middle of a storm, and he's nowhere to be found. Have we ever found ourselves wondering why, if Jesus has the power to stop the storm, he's leaving us to continue living through it? Perhaps for some of us, there have been times when the storm we are in feels so terrifying and so dangerous that we're not sure we're even going to survive it. Now, we know how this particular storm ends. We know that Peter, in a demonstration of amazing faith, gets out of the boat and walks across the water towards Jesus. We also know that just moments later, he takes his eyes off Jesus and his focus shifts to the storm raging around him, and he immediately begins to sink. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Faith, like anxiety, can go up and down depending on the circumstances, on the size of the waves or the strength of the storm. And that is okay. Yes, Peter may momentarily have wavered in his faith, but ultimately, he was the only one who was prepared to get out of the boat in the first place. When the disciples come out the other side of the storm, they have a much better, much deeper understanding of who Jesus is. This is the first time in the Gospel of Matthew that the disciples actually definitively call Jesus the Son of God. Until now, they've referred to him as a teacher or a prophet. They also learn things about themselves. They learn what they're capable of through Jesus. The next time they go through a storm, literal or metaphorical, they will go through it differently. They'll take what they've learned and be stronger and more resilient for it. And the same can be true for us. Faith isn't the opposite of fear. Faith is about acknowledging all of our fears and anxieties and their impacts on us, and, like Peter, looking to Jesus to keep us from sinking. A writer called Curtis Chang has said that many Christians have inadvertently been holding on to an image of God as some sort of cosmic insurance broker in the sky. That God exists and that we believe in him so that we will be guaranteed against suffering. And when that doesn't happen, we feel that God has let us down, and perhaps we begin to lose our faith. But the truth is that God never promised that he exists to ensure that we never experience hard times. We live in a fallen world. a chaotic and unpredictable world, as Matthew 14 has demonstrated. Suffering, pain, and ultimately death are an intrinsic and inescapable part of what it is to be human. No wonder we are anxious. Deep down, we know that no matter how hard we try or how many precautionary measures we take, we can never prevent bad things from ever happening to us. We need to learn to live with anxiety, to live with the fear of the possibility of something bad happening, because we can never guarantee that it won't. We can't avoid suffering, so we need to find a pathway through suffering. And that's where the Christian faith can provide an answer that can't be found anywhere else. The promise of restoration, of resurrection. The Bible tells us that we will experience suffering, but that if we're able to go through that suffering, held by Jesus, then we will come out the other side to resurrection, to the place that we get back everything that we have lost, where everything that hurts will be healed and every wrong will be made right. This is particularly poignant for us today, not only during the season of Lent and as we look ahead to Easter, but also on Mother's Day and the different emotions that stirs up for each of us. We can get through periods of fear and anxiety because we know that it is not how things will end. We know that we are held by God as we go through the storms of life, and that on the other side of the lake is restoration.